The winter of 1947 hit the Midwest harder than anyone expected. By mid-November, temperatures in southern Iowa had already plummeted to 15 below zero, and farmers across Warren County knew they were in trouble. The corn harvest was only halfway complete, and every day that passed meant more crop loss, more money slipping away, and more uncertainty about whether families would make it through to spring. In a small farming community just outside Indianola, a man named Harold Jennings was facing the same crisis as his neighbors. Harold was a third-generation farmer who'd inherited 200 acres from his father, and he'd spent his entire adult life working that land. He was known throughout the county as a cautious man, someone who followed the rules, paid his taxes on time, and never caused trouble. But that November, Harold was about to make a decision that would put him at odds with federal regulators, risk everything he'd built, and ultimately change how farmers across the region approached one of agriculture's most persistent problems. The issue wasn't just the early cold snap. The real problem was moisture. That fall had been unusually wet, with rain continuing well into October when fields should have been drying out. Harold's corn was still standing in the field, but the kernels were holding 28 to 30% moisture content. The federal grain standards of the time set the safe storage limit at 15.5%. Anything above that, and you were looking at spoilage, mold, and total crop loss. The government's official position was clear. Corn above that moisture threshold couldn't be safely stored and shouldn't be harvested until it dried naturally in the field. But Harold didn't have time to wait for natural drying. The weather forecasts, which farmers received through their local agricultural extension offices and radio broadcasts, were predicting heavy snow within the week. If that corn stayed in the field and got buried under snow, it would be a complete loss. His family would lose an entire year's income. The farm might not survive. Harold had heard rumors about a device that some farmers were using quietly, almost secretly. It was called a grain dryer, and the concept was straightforward enough. You forced heated air through wet grain to reduce its moisture content artificially. The problem was that this practice existed in a legal gray area. The federal government, through the Department of Agriculture, hadn't approved any mechanical drying systems for on-farm use. The official reasoning was concerns about fire hazards and the potential for improper drying that could lead to grain quality issues. Some farmers believed the real reason was that commercial grain elevators wanted to maintain their monopoly on grain drying services, which they charged premium rates for. Commercial grain dryers existed at the big elevator operations in town, but they couldn't handle the volume that was coming in that November. Farmers were being told they'd have to wait weeks to get their grain dried, and even then, they'd pay 15 to 20 cents per bushel for the service. For Harold, with roughly 6,000 bushels still in the field, that would mean nearly $1,000 in drying fees, assuming he could even get access to the facility before his crop was destroyed. So Harold did what desperate farmers had done for generations. He improvised. He'd been talking to a neighbor named Dutch Kowalski, whose family had emigrated from Poland before the war. Dutch had a background in industrial equipment repair and had been quietly building grain dryers in his workshop, using surplus military parts and salvaged materials. These weren't sophisticated machines. They consisted of a firebox, a fan system pulled from old ventilation units, and a series of perforated metal bins that allowed hot air to circulate through the grain. Dutch had been running one on his own farm for 2 seasons, and Harold had seen the results. The grain came out clean, dry, and perfectly suitable for storage or sale. The transaction happened on a cold Tuesday morning. Harold drove his truck to Dutch's property, and the two men loaded the dryer components into the bed. Dutch didn't ask for payment up front. He knew Harold was good for it, and besides, this was how rural communities functioned. People helped each other first and settled accounts later. Dutch did give Harold one warning. Don't tell anyone from the county extension office. Don't mention it to the grain elevator operators. And absolutely don't let any federal agricultural inspectors know what you're doing. Harold set up the dryer in his largest barn, the one his grandfather had built back in 1910. The barn had good ventilation, which was critical for fire safety, and enough space to stage the wet corn before and after drying. The system Dutch had built was simple, but required constant attention. You loaded wet corn into the upper bins, started the fire in the firebox using corn cobs and scrap wood for fuel, and ran the fan to push heated air up through the grain. Every few hours you had to rotate the grain, check the temperature to make sure it wasn't getting too hot, and monitor the moisture content by hand. Harold had a tool for checking moisture that his father had taught him to use, the bite test. You took a kernel, bit down on it, and judged the moisture by how it felt and tasted. If it shattered cleanly between your teeth with a sharp crack, it was dry enough. If it compressed or felt soft, it needed more time. This wasn't scientific, but it had worked for decades, and Harold trusted his own judgment more than any government standard. The first batch took 36 hours to dry properly. Harold barely slept during that time. He'd doze in a chair in the barn, wake up every 2 hours to check the fire and rotate the grain, then go back to his fitful rest. His wife Margaret brought him meals and coffee, and she didn't complain about the risk they were taking. She'd grown up on a farm herself. She understood that sometimes survival meant bending rules that didn't account for the reality of agricultural life. By the end of the first week, Harold had dried and stored nearly 2,000 bushels. The corn was testing at 14% moisture, well within safe storage limits. He'd burned through a substantial amount of fuel, and the work was exhausting, but he was saving his harvest. More importantly, word was getting around the community. Other farmers started showing up at Harold's place, usually after dark. They'd pull their trucks into the barn area, look at the drying system Dutch had built, and ask quiet questions. How much corn could it handle in a day? What kind of fuel efficiency was Harold seeing? Had he had any problems with fire or over-drying? Harold answered honestly. The system worked, but it was labor-intensive and required constant monitoring. It wasn't a miracle solution, but it was better than watching your crop rot or paying fees you couldn't afford to the commercial operations. By the second week, 3 more farmers in the area had purchased dryers from Dutch. The unofficial network was expanding, and Harold had become something of a reluctant leader in what was essentially a small-scale rebellion against federal agricultural policy. None of these farmers saw themselves as criminals or troublemakers. They were simply trying to save their livelihoods, using available technology that the government hadn't caught up with yet. The tension came to a head in early December when a representative from the County Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Office made an unannounced visit to Harold's farm. The ASCS was the federal agency responsible for overseeing farm programs, and part of their mandate was ensuring farmers complied with grain handling and storage regulations. The representative, a young man named Thomas Brennan, who'd only been in the job for 6 months, had heard rumors about on-farm grain drying and wanted to investigate. Harold was in the barn when Brennan arrived. There was no hiding what he was doing. The dryer was running, hot air was blowing through several hundred bushels of corn, and the whole operation was clearly visible. Harold made a decision in that moment that would define how this situation would resolve. Instead of making excuses or trying to hide the equipment, he walked Brennan through the entire process. He explained the moisture content problem, showed him the temperature monitoring system, demonstrated the safety precautions he'd implemented, and most importantly, showed him the quality of the dried grain. Brennan was in a difficult position. Technically, what Harold was doing violated federal guidelines, but Brennan was also a practical person who understood farming. His own family had farmed in Illinois before the Depression forced them off the land. He could see that Harold wasn't being reckless or endangering anyone. The system was crude but effective, and the alternative was crop loss that would devastate the local agricultural economy. Brennan told Harold he'd have to file a report, but he also said something that gave Harold hope. The federal government was already reviewing its policies on-farm grain drying. The technology had advanced significantly during the war years, and there was growing recognition that farmers needed more flexibility in handling their crops. Brennan said he'd note in his report that Harold's operation appeared to be safe and that the grain quality was maintained. He couldn't promise anything, but he suggested that enforcement action was unlikely given the circumstances. That conversation marked a turning point. Over the next several months, the federal government did indeed revise its policies on grain drying. The Department of Agriculture published new guidelines that allowed for approved on-farm drying systems, provided they met certain safety and quality standards. Manufacturers began producing commercial versions of the improvised systems that farmers like Harold and Dutch had been cobbling together. What had been illegal in November was officially sanctioned by the following harvest season. Harold finished drying his entire corn crop by mid-December. He didn't lose a single bushel to weather or spoilage. When he sold his grain in January, he received top prices because the quality was excellent and supply was tight after so many farmers had lost crops to the early winter. The income was enough to not only sustain his family through the winter, but to invest in improvements for the next season. He paid Dutch for the dryer and added enough extra to cover Dutch's help with maintenance and modifications. The impact of that winter went beyond Harold's individual success. The community of farmers who'd adopted grain drying early became informal experts who helped their neighbors transition to the new technology as it became legal and commercially available. Dutch Kowalski eventually started a small business building and servicing grain dryers, and his designs influenced some of the early commercial models that came to market in the 1950s. The story also highlighted something fundamental about American agricultural history. Farmers have always been innovators out of necessity. When official systems and institutions can't respond quickly enough to real-world problems, farmers adapt, improvise, and create their own solutions. Sometimes those solutions exist in legal gray areas, sometimes they involve risk, but they emerge from deep practical knowledge, community cooperation, and the understanding that in agriculture, timing is everything, and crop loss can mean the difference between survival and failure. The broader lesson from Harold's experience in 1947 was that agricultural policy needed to be more responsive to on-the-ground reality. Federal agencies had been making rules based on theoretical concerns about safety and quality without fully appreciating that farmers were capable of managing those risks themselves when given the right tools and information. The shift toward allowing on-farm grain drying was one of several policy changes in the post-war years that gave farmers more autonomy and control over their operations. This autonomy came with responsibility. As grain drying became more common, farmers did have to learn proper techniques to avoid fire hazards and maintain grain quality. Extension services developed training programs. Equipment manufacturers provided detailed operating instructions. Insurance companies established standards that farmers had to meet to maintain coverage. The informal knowledge that Harold and others had developed through trial and error became formalized and standardized, which was ultimately good for everyone involved. By the early 1950s, on-farm grain drying had become routine across the Midwest. The technology continued to improve, with better temperature controls, more efficient fuel systems, and automated monitoring that reduced the labor burden. What had required Harold's constant attention for 36 hours could eventually be accomplished with a few hours of setup and periodic checking. The fundamental principle remained the same, moving heated air through grain to reduce moisture content, but the execution became safer, more reliable, and more accessible to farmers of all scales. Harold continued farming his land until 1972, when he retired and passed the operation to his son. In all those years, he never forgot the winter of '47 and the gamble he'd taken with Dutch's improvised grain dryer. He'd tell the story to younger farmers who were dealing with their own challenges and regulatory obstacles, and his advice was always the same. Know your craft, trust your judgment, work with your community, and don't be afraid to do what needs to be done to save your harvest, even if it means pushing back against rules that don't serve the reality you're living. The legacy of that winter extended beyond individual farms or even the grain drying technology itself. It became part of the local folklore, a story that illustrated the resilience and ingenuity of rural communities during a challenging period in American agricultural history. When the Department of Agriculture eventually published its revised grain handling guidelines, the preamble acknowledged that farmers had demonstrated through practical experience that on-farm drying could be done safely and effectively. That acknowledgement was rare in federal policy documents, and it represented a recognition that knowledge flows both ways, not just from government experts to farmers, but from farmers' lived experience back to the policymakers who created the rules they had to follow. For Harold, the most meaningful outcome wasn't the money he saved or the recognition he received locally. It was knowing that when his family's survival was on the line, he'd made the right call. He'd assessed the risk, sought out the best available technology, implemented it carefully, and succeeded in preserving an entire season's work. In the calculus of farming, where so much depends on factors beyond your control, weather, markets, pests, disease, being able to control even one variable can make all the difference. That winter, Harold controlled moisture content, and in doing so, he secured his family's future and contributed to a broader transformation in how American farmers managed their grain harvests. The story of Harold Jennings and his illegal barn tool is ultimately a story about adaptation, community, and the constant negotiation between regulation and practical necessity that has always characterized American agriculture. It reminds us that some of the most important innovations in farming didn't come from universities or government research stations or agricultural corporations. They came from people like Dutch Kowalski, tinkering in a workshop with surplus military parts, and from people like Harold Jennings, willing to take a calculated risk when everything was on the line. These were ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because that's what farming required and still requires, every single season. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found this story interesting and want to see more content about the forgotten innovations and untold stories of American agricultural history, please subscribe to our channel, give this video a like, and share it with anyone who appreciates the ingenuity and resilience of farming communities. This video is inspired by real events and historical farming practices, and it is not intended to represent or offend any individual or group.